Hey, my friends, it's Rich Lewis. I hope you're doing well today. So, today is my latest installment in my Did You Know teaching series. This will be video number 19, and we are going to be finishing out our three-part series where we've been studying the Christian doctrine of adoption entitled Adoption versus Identity. And today is going to be part 3 of that series. Part 3 is entitled Huiothesia, a coming of age ceremony. I'm excited to share this with you as we finish things out and bring in the final points. So go ahead and buckle up and sit back and enjoy. I hope I can bless you today. I hope I can clarify some things. So, did you know that the concept of being adopted into God's family is actually not in the Bible? Now, hold on a second, Rich. Okay, you tend to say some thought-provoking kind of things. How can you say that? Because I know for a fact that I remember reading parts of Scripture that literally use the word adopted or adoption. I know you have. Okay, I don't doubt that. You're absolutely right. It does have those words in there. But what I want to challenge today is when you have seen those passages talking about the idea of being adopted or the idea of adoption, it's not really talking about adoption. Well, that's really confusing, Rich. Yeah, I know it's kind of confusing to me too in the beginning of this study, but as you dig more into what the ancient languages are actually referencing, you're going to find it's not this idea of adoption like we would see it through our 21st century cultural lens. Rather, it's this idea of maturity, a coming of age type of maturity. And it's so powerful, such a more powerful lens to look at it through when we understand what the biblical authors are talking about here. Okay, so, or actually one author to be exact. So let's go ahead and dig into that. So remember, let's do our little cultural lens exercise. Let's take our glasses off and set it on the table and put their glasses on so we can see it through their eyes, okay? Now, our glasses that we naturally wear when we think of adoption, we're going to think of a little boy or a little girl whose parents died or whose parents decided that they didn't want to be parents anymore. And so this child is being welcomed in to another family that was not biologically their own, or even if they were somewhat biologically related, it still wasn't their direct family. And so the child has become a new member of a new family. That's what we tend to look at this as. But this is not what the Bible is talking about. What you're going to find as you dig into this, if you want to go as deep into it as I have, you're going to find that this idea of adoption has nothing to do with placing an orphan in a family, and it has everything to do with coming to a place of maturity and coming of age ceremony, knowing who you are, what your identity is, and now stepping into the fullness of what all that means. So the entire foundation of this doctrine of adoption in Christianity, it really all primarily rests upon the translation of one Greek word. I know that sounds kind of odd, and you may not have heard that before, but I promise you it's going to make more sense as we unpack this. It's this one word that is used, that's only found in the New Testament, and Paul is the only biblical writer to ever use this word. He used this word, Huiothesia, that I mentioned a second ago in the title. He uses this word 5 times in 3 of his letters. Now, here's the exact references if you ever want to look them up for yourself and dig more into it. You'll find them in the books of Ephesians, Galatians, and Romans. To be exact, you'll find one reference in Ephesians, one in Galatians, and 3 references in Romans. So the exact references are Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5, Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 5. You have Romans 8:15, Romans 8:23, and Romans 9:4. Now, essentially, to kind of do the Rich Lewis paraphrase of what each one of these verses are saying, and it'll probably jog your memory because I know you've read them before. You'll find that Paul is talking about how God chose us for adoption as sons before the foundation of the world. In the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son to redeem us so that we might receive the adoption of sons. We've received a spirit of adoption as sons, where we cry out, Abba, Father, to Him. Right now, we groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, which is the redemption of our body. So that's the general premise, kind of putting all those passages together at the same time. But a very interesting thing about this is if you look at it on the temporal side of things, okay, past, present, future, what Paul's referencing here is something that has not happened yet. Read it again for yourself. Then you'll start to realize, wait a minute, yeah, Paul's talking about something that happens in the future. Paul is not talking about this idea of when I get saved, when I come to know who Christ is, when I receive the salvation that Christ has given me, then all of a sudden I'm adopted into the family. You've probably heard that before, preached in different sermons and taught in different teachings, but that would not be accurate here. That's not what Paul's talking about. He's not talking about regeneration. He's not talking about salvation. He's not talking about being born again. That's already happened in his mindset here. He's talking about this idea of adoption is something that is going to happen in the future, and it's going to be big. It's going to be huge. It's going to be this thing that happens after earth. Let's dig more into it. So, this word, Huiothesia, in fact, you know what, this is probably a good time for me to bring this up. It's been a while since I've used my little sidekick right here, so I'm going to see if I can get the board just right to where we can see some of these concepts on here. I'm having to reverse this in my... Okay, there we go. All right, so hopefully you can see that and I'm not blinding you. So this Greek word, we're going to go to the very top. It's the word Huiothesia. It starts with an H right there. It looks like Huiothesia, okay, but it's pronounced Huiothesia. Now, what this is a Greek word, a Greek compound word, okay. A compound word is a single word made of two original words, okay. And these two original words, I want to see if I can map this out for you on here, okay. You have over here, you have the word huios, and then over here you have the word tithemi, okay? When you combine them together, it spells the compound word huiothesia, okay? Huios, if you look at it over here, it means an adult son, okay? Tithemi over here means the placing or placement of. In fact, here's the real definition down here at the bottom. That word Huiothesia, it really means the placing of the son. Now, in translations, you've heard me talk about Jerome's Latin Vulgate before. Okay, it was written, I believe, in the 4th century. So you have what he used to translate the Greek word Huiothesia was the Latin word adoptio. Hey, that kind of sounds familiar, Rich. Yeah, that's where you're getting the word adoption from that we use in the English. But that was the best word that Jerome thought would be to describe Huiothesia. But once again, it's not exactly what Huiothesia is talking about. What's really going on is, oops, there's the blinding light again. I'm sorry about that. What's going on is this idea of something in the future. It's a coming of age ceremony, and it's actually this maturity ceremony called the toga virilis ceremony. It was a Roman ceremony. Dig into your history and you'll discover more about it. Oh, it's so fascinating. So we got that on the whiteboard. You've got that to where you can rewind it and pause it and write it down. Now, what does all of this mean here? Okay, so the lens that Paul would have been looking at this through, he would have had this concept thinking about 3 different coming of age ceremonies: a Jewish ceremony, an Greek ceremony, and a Roman ceremony, okay? So just to give you kind of a brief understanding of what each of those coming of age ceremonies would have been, these would have been the lenses that he would have been looking through and thinking through, and he's describing this huge thing that's going to happen in the future, this Huiothesia that's going to happen on this gigantic cosmic level for humanity. All right, so the first thing, a Jewish ceremony, that would have been very near and dear to him because he was the Jew of Jews, okay? That was his culture, and he would have, at some point, he would have experienced, probably around the age of 12 years old, he would have gone through the Jewish ceremony called the bar mitzvah ceremony. So on the first Sabbath day, after a Jewish boy turned 12 years of age, his dad would take him to the synagogue, okay, that's the local church for the Jews, take him to the synagogue, and that's where he would become what was called a son of the law. And dad would pray and son would pray these very passionate prayers. Dad would pray this prayer saying something along the lines of like, all blessings to God who has taken from me the responsibility of this boy. And then the son, in return, he would say, God of my fathers, on this holy day, this marks my passage from boyhood to manhood, and I humbly raise my eyes before you and unto you, and I declare with sincerity and truth that all my life I will keep your commandments. That the word mitzvah, the Hebrew word there, that's what we get translated as the word commandment. Really, more literally, it means guideposts. It means, trail markers along the trail to make sure I'm pointing in the right direction. But we translate it as commandments. And so now the boy is considered a man, even though he's 12 years old. This is his bar mitzvah ceremony. It means the son of accountability, or the son of the commandment ceremony. Girls had their own coming of age ceremony. Theirs was the bat mitzvah ceremony, but that's a little side note right there. So this would have been the Jewish ceremony. Paul would have experienced this, even though he grew up in a part of the Roman Empire in the city of Tarsus. He would have still had his own bar mitzvah ceremony, being a good practicing Jew. So that's one of the first lenses that he's thinking about in this big thing to come in the future. Then we have the Greek ceremony. So the Greek ceremony would have happened in places like Athens, for instance. And so within the Greek culture, in Greece, a boy was considered to be under his father's care from the ages of 17 until he was 18. And when he turned 18, he became what was called an ephebos. Okay, and ephebos, that's a Greek way of saying a cadet, okay, like a trainee. And for the next 2 years, he was under the direction of the state. Now, with the Athenian culture, the tribes of Athens, they had different tribes, 10 tribes, or clans as they were called sometimes. And so these 10 clans, 10 tribes, you had to be welcomed in like an official member of them. Even if you grew up in it, you were still welcomed in at some point within this particular ceremony that they had. And so before the boy could become an official ephebos, an official cadet, the community would hold this festival for him and his family called the Apaturia Festival. And Apaturia, this is where he was officially received into the clan, into that particular tribe. And as a ceremonial act of this, they would take his hair. His hair had been growing ever since he was little. They would take his long hair and they would cut it off and they would offer it as a sacrifice to the gods. Okay, so that was the Greek ceremony that Paul would have been aware of in all of his different missionary journeys. He would have seen this, known it culturally, and seen it with his own eyes. Now we get to the climax. He's actually using language in these 5 passages that I quoted a minute ago in Ephesians, Galatians, and Romans. What he's describing, the language is so perfect for this, particularly in Galatians. He is thinking about the Roman ceremony known as the toga virilis ceremony. It's so exciting. It really is, guys. Okay, so with this Roman ceremony, under Roman law, the boy would become a man somewhere between the ages typically of 14 to 17. Sometimes it would happen a little bit past 17. It could even happen into your 20s at times. It really all depended on what the father thought about you, like if you were ready to go through this. But usually, typically, it's 14 to 17. And there was this sacred festival that they would have, that the family would have for themselves, called the Liberalia Festival. And this is where the child would have to do several things to enter into manhood. So the first thing he would have to do is he would take off his youth toga and he would exchange it for his adult toga. Now, what's significant about that, the youth toga, the way that you could tell that they had one of these on was down at the bottom of the toga, just above the foot, there was this hem, and this hem was usually like a bluish or purplish color. And whenever you saw a young man walking around in a toga that had that bluish purplish hem at the bottom, that was visually showing, oh, he hasn't went through the ceremony just yet. He's not of age. He is not fully mature just yet. So the first thing they would do is exchange the togas. The second thing they would do is they would take off what's called their bulla, okay, B-U-L-L-A, their bulla necklace. And it was this particular, it was actually, usually it was a golden necklace, and they wore it, it served some different purposes. One, when you saw it, you knew they were still a kid, because adults didn't have a bulla necklace on anymore. But the way that they used it, it was like this magical amulet. It was supposed to have magical powers to be able to give them good luck and ward off evil spirits. Okay, so that was another thing too. They would take off their magic necklace and they would lay it on the altar, and then they would exchange their togas. And then there was usually a third part that would happen. Boys would typically have a ball as a toy that they would play with. Girls would have a doll. Girls would go through similar coming of age ceremonies in all 3 of the cultures, Jewish, Greek, and Roman. But the boy would take his ball and he would offer it to the god Apollo, and it was his way of showing that he had put away childish things. So they laid down their ball, they laid down their necklace, the bulla necklace, and they laid down their child toga. And what are they putting on now? It's the adult toga. Well, what did that look like, Rich? Oh man, this is where it gets cool. This is where, if you read like the book of Revelation and other apocalyptic literature, this is where you start exchanging their robes and the white robe and all this kind of so cool. So the phrase toga virilis, virilis means manhood. It means maturity. This is the toga virilis ceremony of exchanging the togas. He's exchanging it for a pure white toga. Sometimes it was referred to as the white dress or the gown of freedom. Gown of freedom means toga libera. Okay, remember this is the liberalia. Okay, the libera means freedom. Okay, this is the freedom ceremony. Freedom from being a child and entering into the freedom of what it means to be a full-grown man, a full adult. So this is the toga, the white toga, the toga pura. Okay, it's so powerful, guys, when you let it sink in for a second. This is the whole thing that they would go through to symbolize the new authority that they had. So what did this authority bring? What did this ceremony mark? Well, now you're a full citizen in the empire. You have the full right to vote in the assembly. Now you can enter into military service. And most importantly, you are now able to carry out all the responsibilities of what it means to be a full heir of your father's household, of your family's household. You're fully legally vested with all the rights, the powers, the privileges of what it means to be a son and what it means to manage that possession and that wealth and that status. And no longer are you viewed as an immature child. Man, that's so powerful. These are the earth images that Paul's thinking about that are just shadows and copies to describe this huge cosmic ceremony that he's envisioning is going to happen someday. That is so powerful. Now, Rich, were there times when, like, sometimes they would need to have a ceremony for a non-biological child to be adopted into a family, whether they were related to them or not? They would use this ceremony. They would use it for this, but you have to understand that was very rare. 99% of the time, this was a common ceremony that every biological family would have for their biological son, okay? So that's the norm. You did have some exceptions in those situations where parents had died and the child was adopted into another family or distant relatives. You even had, usually we have historical examples of this happening within the Roman emperor family. So, and really the main reason for that was for political purposes. So, a few high-level adoptions that you have in history would be some famous emperors such as Augustus or Tiberius, a couple of more like Claudius and Nero, and even the famous Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And the reason why they did that is because if the Roman emperor did not think their biological son was fit to rule the empire, well, then they would pick another one to come in, but they were usually related to him. It would usually be like a nephew. And so you do have, in all fairness, you have those examples, but remember, that's not the norm. The norm here is the majority of the time, overwhelming majority of the time, this is a common thing that you do for your biological children. So powerful, so powerful. Now, the last couple of points I want to make on this. Well, what does the Old Testament say about this? Because if you remember, I've told you about this resource called the Septuagint before. Okay, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It was created about 300 years before Christ came to earth. This is a really powerful point right here. Guys, if Huiothesia in the Greek really does mean adoption, why was it never used in the Septuagint? That is an interesting question right there. I wonder why. Yeah, because if you've read the Old Testament or even parts of it, there are some different examples in there of what we would think would be adoption kind of things. There's at least about a half a dozen of them. The two most prominent examples I'll give you are the stories of Moses and the story of Esther. If you want to read about each of their stories, go to Exodus chapter 2 and you'll read about Moses, and you go to Esther chapter 2 and you'll read about Esther. Moses was by all means adopted into a family he was not related to, okay? Pharaoh's daughter raised him. Moses' biological mama put him in a basket and floated him down the Nile because the Pharaoh was killing Jewish babies at that time. And so Pharaoh's daughter welcomed Moses into the family. Okay, that's an example of adoption. Huiothesia was never used to describe that. That's interesting. The story of Esther. Esther, her family died. Her uncle Mordecai brought her into his family. Huiothesia was never used to describe that. I think those are powerful points right there, but I'll let you do your own logical conclusions on that, okay? How do we wrap this out, guys? Well, in conclusion, let's look at it like this. You may be asking yourself the question, why did I spend all this time? I've got about an hour worth of content between these 3 videos. Why did I spend so much time talking about this idea of adoption versus identity? Why did I spend all this time? Why did I have a video called The Genos of Theos? Why did I have this video called God's Kids versus Devil Kids? And now I got this coming of age ceremony. The reason why, guys, I love you. And I want you to know who you are. The reason why I spend so much time on this, I want you to understand who you are. I want you to know that you are a child of God, and your daddy loves you more than you could ever imagine. Imagine the best idea that you could ever have of what a parent could be like. Mother, father, and God, he's so much beyond that. He's light years beyond that. He's better than good. He really is. So I want you to understand who all 7 billion of us, by the way, okay? It's not just some of us versus others. Every one of us is God's kids, every single one of us. But we're not all awakened to it. So if you can become awakened to that reality, if you can let God awaken you to that reality, now you can start telling other people about what their identity is. And when we know what our identity is, when we know that we're one of His kids and we know what the truth is, because we've asked Him to open our eyes to this reality, oh my gosh, now we get to act like it. So to wrap this out, know who you are, child of God. Know where you come from. You got His DNA inside of Him. You're the genos of Theos. And know where you're going. Wherever you're going, He's with you. He's by your side. There's this big cosmic coming of age ceremony that we're all going to experience someday. You know, there's this really powerful scene at the end of my book, my novel, The Last Heart, A Story of Undying Love. And it's where Carrie and Jesus, they're walking across the bridge of light, and they're about to take that first step into the place of light. And as you could probably guess, that's heaven. And everyone's celebrating. They're in the light. There's billions and billions. I think I even talk about how there might be even trillions of not just people, but otherworldly beings. And it's beautiful. It's a brand new creation and all that. And it's the celebration of celebrations. And everyone's so excited. And Carrie turns to Jesus and she says, Jesus, why is everyone so excited to see me? And he turns and he looks at her deep in her eyes. And he says, because, my dear, you were the last heart to win. And now, my kingdom is complete. Man, until the last heart is won, until the last lost child comes home. Whew, that's exciting. I hope this blesses you. I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.